Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's October 4th, 2023, and today we are speaking with Dr. Alex Kaloyanides, Associate Professor in Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Alex featured on the show 3 years ago to discuss her research, including one article on the little-known story of King Mindon's strategic use of Buddhism to negotiate the purchase of thousands of Enfield rifles to arm his palace guards just a year before two of his sons launched a coup against him. But for this chat, in 2023, we'll be talking about Alex's new book published with Columbia University Press titled Baptizing Burma, Religious Change in the Last Buddhist Kingdom, which explores Baptist interactions in Burma through objects from slices in time over a span of 200 years, from 1813 to 2013. Hello and welcome back, Alex.
Thanks, Luke. It's good to be back.
It's really great to have you here, and it was a pleasure reading your book, which I did recently when I was on holiday. As we said, it's called Baptizing Burma, but I noted that in the opening pages, you write, in spite of its active presence in Burma, the Baptist mission never swept the country as it had dreamed. So I thought to get us started, we could simply ask what was, and maybe is, the American Baptist mission, and what was this sweeping dream? What was the dream it had for 19th century Burma?
The American Baptist mission started in 1813. There were a couple of young Americans just in their mid-20s who end up by accident in Burma. They wanted to go to India. They had this romantic notion of what was happening in India and the possibilities for evangelism, but they get to India and the local communities don't want them, the British authorities don't want them, so they end up actually by accident in Rangoon. But they established this mission anyway, and they're very excited once they learn more and more about the country and its possibilities for conversion. But in some ways, it proves to be a total failure. It really does not work at all among the mainstream Bamar, mainstream Buddhists. They seem less interested than anyone else in Christianity and conversion, especially. If anything, their Buddhist identity becomes more pronounced over the course of the mission. But it was also, in some ways, a big success in the sense that leading till today, there's the largest religion next to Buddhism is Baptist Christianity. So the form of Christianity that's most popular is Baptist Christianity because of this history of the mission. And so it was both a failure and in some ways a success. And what I was trying to do was think about not only the particular history of this one mission that the Americans started and then soon spread to different local communities taking up evangelical work, but also what this meant for the changing just religious landscape at the time, because this is 1813, the Konbaung dynasty. There are a lot of changes happening there. You know, the next decade, we have the first Anglo-Burmese War. And so a question I had for the book was, what was the particular history of this kind of odd mission to the country? And then what did that mean for larger cultural and religious political change?
Yeah, I think your book strives to paint a more sort of nuanced picture than some people might think of, the sort of monolithic American mission facilitating colonial violence in the 19th century. As we know, there were these three wars waged by the British. And I think it is much more nuanced than that. But I think we should still ask sort of the question, how was the Baptist mission entangled with this? You said they came via British India. You know, how was the mission entangled with the British colonial project, or facilitated by, or did it facilitate the colonial project? And I guess these three major wars that changed Burmese history forever.
Yes, it's totally right to keep that in mind. And, you know, as much as I try to think about it in different ways and ask questions, I do want to be clear that the mission was both entangled with and continued to promote colonialism and Western imperialism in the country, even when it didn't mean to or intend to. And so you had just the historical fact that, like you said, they came through British India, and even their sort of romance with the, you know, what they called the East came out of this sort of romantic and early sort of Orientalist ideas of this exotic other out there. And so this idea of wanting to sort of go there, travel, and evangelize and change the culture. And, these people came, they were the first Americans who were living, they were the first, it was the first American foreign mission. And so the first Americans who are living in a Buddhist country, they're learning languages. The first missionary, Adoniram Judson, he did a lot of work studying Burmese. He wrote a Burmese English dictionary. He was the first one to translate the Bible into Burmese. And so as these people moved to the country and learned languages and made important connections with communities, had relationships there, they grew to respect and admire a lot about Burmese culture. And so there are ways that, they would write these kind of glowing accounts of Burmese Buddhism. And oftentimes they were contrasting it with Hinduism in India and saying, oh, this is a much more humane and ethical religion. But still, even when we find these seemingly positive accounts of Burmese Buddhism that we see were clearly influenced by local people who were themselves promoting a form of Burmese Buddhism for different reasons, that even when they were doing that, it was part of this larger way of making lists of world religions where Protestant Christianity was still at the top. And so that way of classifying religions, Buddhism at this time is getting elevated to a world religion, sometimes just second to Christianity, but still it's as part of this hierarchy, right? And that kind of idea that Western countries, that Europe and America had, the best religion in the world, and that those kinds of ideas did justify forms of colonialism and violence. And so these missionaries, they had their own issues with the British. I mean, some of them, they had parents or grandparents who had fought in the Revolutionary War, in America. So they had concerns about the British when they came over. But still, the larger work of sort of comparative religions, English language training, those kinds of changes that were happening, identity formation, really looking around, surveying the land and identifying, okay, this is this people group with this language and working on scripts for this language. All of that work in some ended up contributing to the colonial project, even if there are pockets of times where it seemed to challenge that.
But of course, there were other major proselytizing forces other than British colonialism and related Christian preaching in 19th century Burma too. Like, you write about how the Baptists had comparatively more success with upland peoples or non-Buddhist populations, but I kind of wonder about how the missionaries thought about those people compared to the Buddhists. And were those Baptist missionaries competing for conversions in the hills? I mean, were these people who had been living side by side with Buddhism for a long time, for example, was it thought about that way?
I think there was some sense of competition, especially as there was more attention from the sort of centers of power to this proselytization, or even now when you look at people, efforts to bring Buddhism to the, people in the upland region. So I think as the mission went on, there was some sense of competition. I think in the early years and decades of the mission, there wasn't so much of a sense that people were paying much attention to what was happening in these more remote or sort of marginalized communities. And so there, in that case, they kind of were able to have more freedom. The further away they stayed from centers of power, the more freedom that these missionaries experienced. And then as these missionaries started spending more time with different communities, the communities themselves were very active in shaping what they saw as, religious change. The Karen, for example, didn't see this as necessarily as some foreign religion coming in that they were going to convert to, but instead really saw this as a recovery of their own religious history and identity. And so, they had a lot to say and a lot to do with the shape of conversion in their communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now I think maybe we'll go into the very unique structure to your book. You've structured it around what you refer to as holy objects, four in particular holy objects. These are the book, the school, the pagoda, and the portrait. But before we get into those, why did you adopt this structure? And why did you write this religious history through these items? You could have written it in so many different ways.
When I first started to work on this, I did think of it more chronologically, more as a historian, sort of thinking about, from the beginning of the mission as it developed. But what happened as I was researching is that I kept coming across these objects, that these objects became more and more prevalent in the archival work that I was doing. And then when I was able to travel to Myanmar for some research trips, more and more I kept hearing stories about the importance of books, encounters, strange encounters with books. The significance of the schoolhouse, not just because the American missionary school system became very important, but also the way that these schoolhouses were filled with things like globes and telescopes and maps that really changed the way people imagined their world and other worlds. And then the pagoda, I mean, there's so much writing, people all over time and history and space have written about Myanmar's pagodas and that landscape, but the missionaries were particularly fascinated by the pagodas. And then finally, the portrait comes more out of the 21st century legacy of the mission. And so as I was doing the research, it really, these objects themselves kind of pushed their way into my frame of analysis. And, I really, as I was looking, I was really curious. I wanted to find some sources, I wanted to find someone writing from inside the Burmese court about the missionaries. But the more and more I looked, the more intentional it seemed that there was not a lot of, or any really acknowledgement of the mission from official Burmese sources. We have these chronicles, other kinds of documents where they do not mention, or very rarely mention, Christianity spreading in the country. Similarly, the American writings that they were sending back to the States about what they were doing did not really acknowledge so much of the failure or the way that their own religion was changing into a kind of Southeast Asian religion. They presented as, it's hard, but we're working really, really diligently, and one day this whole country will convert to Christianity. And so I realized that the written sources were so limited, and that the objects, in a way, were able to tell stories that I couldn't really find in some of those texts. And there's also this way that both groups, the Theravada Buddhists in the mainstream and the Baptist Christians, had this complicated relationship with religious media. You have this absent figure at the center of both of them. You have Gautama Buddha, you have Jesus Christ, and then you have concerns and questions about the value of objects in mediating relationships with those figures who are no longer present in this world. And this was the first time these two traditions even came into living contact with each other. So I wanted to think about that, because for the Americans, they came from this Calvinist form of Protestant Christianity that was very cautious and critical of the danger of religious objects, the sense that it was a form of idolatry to picture any occupants of heaven. So the first missionaries that left the States likely never even saw an image of Jesus, an etching of Jesus, that kind of imagery. There was this real concern in American culture about that. And so, then they come to Myanmar and see all of these pagodas and Buddha statues. And so then they tried to, form these debates with locals about materiality and Christians. But of course, the people in Myanmar had long had these sophisticated debates. What they didn't say, oh, you're telling me that the Buddha is not actually in this statue? You're blowing my mind. Instead it was like, yes, we know that, but there's also this way that this statue can have the power of the Buddha. There's this way that this pagoda can have the power of the Buddha. So these sites and these objects became ways that people navigated both worldly power and immaterial power in interesting ways. And so for me, that's when the book kind of came together, was thinking about it as these kind of object case studies.
Awesome. And the first object, as you've said, is the book, which you write for both the Buddhists and the Baptists. Books acted as inanimate guides for understanding immaterial powers as animate forces in the material world. And they were integral to Baptist interactions in Burma in the 19th century. Most people, of course, will think of the Bible, but there was more to it than that. And you write that the Burmese had holy books of their own. So could you please turn the page on this topic? What happened when, for example, the king of Burma was presented with an ornate, beautiful Bible by the first American Baptist missionaries?
Well, I'm sure you and your readers will be very familiar with book culture in Myanmar. I mean, we have the world's largest book, right? This idea that, having the whole entire Pali Canon inscribed on marble slabs that King Mindon commissioned. There are the celebration of the Pali Canon and so on. There's one particular book that I claim, or at least try and suggest, was especially important in this time period. And that's the Kamavacha, this ritual manual. It circulated more robustly. It was somewhat mass produced and very ornately constructed. And it was circulating throughout the Konbaung dynasty. It has ritual manuals that trace back to the earliest Buddhist teachings about how to ordain monks and so on. So the most essential rituals. But actually the format of it, and having it lacquered and gilded and bejeweled, this was this particular Burmese way of treating these objects. So these were circulating well before the American missionaries came. And when they came and started learning Pali, learning Burmese, studying languages, they often studied, simple palm leaf manuscripts, but they were coming into contact with these ritual manuals that people would commission and give to different monasteries for use and for merit. And so when the missionaries finally got their first audience with a king, Adoniram Judson shows up with King Bajira, and he wants to present something to him. So he presents the Bible, and he has it wrapped in cloth, red cloth, using sort of colors, gold and burgundy, these colors that are symbols of religion and power in the country. And presents them to the king, and the king is like, no. First of all, you were asking if you could proselytize with the sort of mainstream society, and no, you can stay to your port cities, you could stay to people outside of sort of mainstream society. And also, we don't want your gift of the book, because they had their own, I said, they had their own sort of book culture. And this was very strong. The literacy rates were really high comparatively in Myanmar at the time. But it wasn't just about reading and writing and understanding. It was also about the use of these objects as powerful objects. They were, like I said, used in the most important ritual practices, and they themselves had a lot of valuable resources put into it. And so what I began to discover was that books were not just ways of representing abstract ideas or passing them on, but in and of themselves, they had this power. And that book, that particular book, the Kamawa or Kamavacha is the Pali, they, over time, seem to have become more and more illustrated with these kinds of spirit lords or sword-bearing figures, kind of deva or nat figures, who are dressed in royal, almost military attire and have swords. And so I suggest that over the course of this time, as the British are waging wars, and as the Americans are missionizing, and as Myanmar is becoming, or Burma at the time is becoming, threatened on its borders with ethnic violence and concerns, as all this is happening, the Burmese court and the kingdom really saw these books as one way of trying to unify the country, of sort of having all of the rituals be under, have these objects participate in them, and to almost conscript spirits into that action. And so I use this object as a way just to show that throughout the country, this idea that books could be very powerful and could be invested in a certain kind of invisible power as well, that wasn't just restricted to the Bama or the Buddhists, but that other people, different minority groups, and also for these Christians as well, that the books themselves seem to have power beyond just the messages inside them.
Yeah, and looking at books in this historical way, you get to really see them as, living documents that change over time, rather than as, static texts as we interact with them in our daily lives, which is really great too. We'll move on to the second object. That's the school, which is, a physical structure really, but you use it to sort of stand in for a lot of different educational objects as well, within and around missionary schools in Burma. You mentioned some of them before, but it also sort of stands in for Western education more broadly as well. And you even draw insight from one unconventional teacher and her dumb dog. So I'm not sure how to get at this, because this chapter is, I think, maybe the longest in the book and quite wide-ranging. But what was so important about the school for the Baptist religion in Burma?
It is probably the longest chapter. It's the last chapter I wrote, even though it's a second chapter in there. And what happened was, the more and more I thought about the legacy of the American mission, the more I realized that for most people who knew something about it, they knew about it from the missionary schools, because the missionary schools had an influence in a larger swath of society because they educated people that did not convert or were not interested in converting. So there were a lot of important figures in mainstream society, a lot of Buddhists that went to these schools. And so I realized that I needed to, if I was going to tell the story of this mission, I needed to talk about the schools. And I started to wonder what it was about going to these schools. And this was the same kind of question I had about for some of these minority groups. What was it about their interest in the mission? And, some scholarship sort of thought about it, previous scholarship thought about it in very strategic economic ways. You go there to learn disciplines that are going to help you advance economically, increase your social position, learn skills. And I'm sure that was part of it. But I started to realize more and more that there were other reasons people were going to these schools, talking to Christians about their ideas of this one powerful God, creator God, that there was this curiosity about other worlds, this exploration of these new religious worlds that were being described and imagined and reimagined in Burma. And that schools were a really interesting place to explore them, specifically because they had things like globes and telescopes and maps. The missionaries, some of these itinerant preachers, were some of the first people to bring these kinds of devices into things like palaces or powerful homes, or they would bring them to pagodas. And this idea that you could look through a telescope and see Saturn with its rings, or that you could see an image of the world as round through a globe. And there were these other devices. One of them, I think it was called the cranotrope. It was hard to actually find more references to it, but these kinds of solar, mechanical models of the universe. And so it really pushed me to think about the way that these schools and this mission was a place for people to explore other worlds, even if they weren't going to convert or believe in a Christian God or change their relationship with karma and liberation. They still were, there was this curiosity. And so I started to rethink about the schools as places where people were exploring other worlds, other religious worlds, and specifically about those devices, because the evidence is so strong that a lot of people would show up to schools or even to some of these gatherings that were, sort of educational gatherings outside of schools. And the missionaries would be like, I want to tell you about the Gospels. And they would be like, actually, I'm much more interested. I heard you have a globe. Can I look at your globe? This sort of sense that there was ways that certain parts of the proselytization was just dismissed outright. But there was this curiosity about these other ways of depicting and imagining the universe. And so I decided to tell the story of these schools through their objects, sort of to build on the other kind of attention to material culture in the book. And then it also allowed me to tell the story of different kinds of ways that women writers and writings about women were so important in this period. So you talked about the woman with her dog. This is Marilla Baker Ingalls. She was the most successful missionary among Burmese Buddhists. And she had been married. Missionaries were supposed to get married. Female missionaries were supposed to get married, but her husband died and she didn't remarry. So she worked as a solitary missionary in the South, in Tonga. And she set up this mission that was really extraordinary. She inherited a property from a Buddhist monk that she had befriended, who had this nat tree, a tree with those spirits known as gnats. And she ended up, rather than, cutting down the tree and saying, stop, worshiping gnats or something, she just changed it up a little bit. So she ended up hanging a picture of Queen Victoria and hanging biblical verses. She even put advertisements for Western medicines. One of the medicines is actually, I think, a kind of opiate. And she hangs all this stuff on this tree. And so in this way, she kind of transforms this Nat shrine into a Christian shrine of sorts. But of course, it's unlike any other Christian shrine. And so in this way, we see that Christianity is becoming a kind of Southeast Asian religion through her own kind of educational practices. And then we have at this time, too, writings from the Burmese side. There's this text, the Sasanavamsa, that is describing Burmese Buddhism. It's a Burmese Buddhist chronicle. And there's this really interesting section of that text where it's talking about women and girls, young girls who are really expert in the classical language of Pali. They're grammarians. They end up embarrassing, men around them. And so I started thinking about these things together. What was it about women and about education that was so important in this time of so much change and conflict and transformation?
Yeah, I really really enjoyed that chapter. And another example of what you're saying is that the statue of the dog, where she was writing home in the letters that you feature, talking about how God works in mysterious ways, and was working through this statue of this dog to teach Buddhists about idolatry and this sort of thing. But you write that actually you can also see it as a way of sort of religious syncretism happening sort of in front of your eyes, right? Like that people in Burma often idolize and put edibles in front of shrines like this, and people were starting to do it to this statue, and you were sort of questioning, I guess, maybe the sort of deeper, more emotional motivation for why she had this statue or something like that?
Yeah, I was interested in the statue because, you read some of these materials and, if you read them just on the face of it, they say, oh, look how successful I am. I'm evangelizing in this place. But of course, we know when we pay a little more attention that, of course, these people didn't really think. She had this cast iron dog that her friends in New York had sent her. And she put it out there, and she would say that she was using it as a way to show, look, this dog can't really protect me against burglars or thieves or things like that. This dog can't do anything. And being analogous to the Buddha statue, you pray to this Buddha, but this Buddha cannot answer your prayers, kind of thing. But then she would spend more time, actually, if you looked at the details, because she was, fluent in Burmese, lived there for decades, knew these people. She starts talking about consecration even, and how her dog was consecrated by fire because it was a metal dog, just like their Buddha statues. But then you have the people kind of coming back at her and saying it's not exactly the same thing, and so you see that in some ways she was using this, and at least using it definitely in her writing back to the States. But I think what was happening on the ground was a lot more complicated. That I think that this dog had a kind of power. It brought people to her mission. There was a curiosity about it. It ends up being treated differently. But it wasn't that people were thinking, oh, this is a real dog, and now I'm going to, a powerful, dog spirit of some kind, and I'm going to pray to it. But instead, that using materials, that materials became the means, using objects became the means to both share new religious ideas and to transform. People were transforming them for their own purposes.
It's all very interesting, but a very entertaining object compared to some of the others, which are far too grand to be entertaining, such as the third object, the pagoda, which, as you mentioned, continues to be hugely important to Burma. It may be the central symbol for the country for foreigners, quite possibly, and still they daily awe hundreds, thousands of visitors in person in Burma and as a symbol. So what did the Baptists think of the Shwedagon Bihar? That was there, of course, when they visited, and were they as enamored by it, or were they, as the British colonialists were, or were they skeptical? Did they see it as, I guess you would know the language that they used better than me, as something wrong?
They were overwhelmed by it. I mean, they were primed to see anything that seemed what they would call idolatry or heathenism. They were primed to see that as dangerous, as the problem that needed to be solved, as what needed to be eradicated. So they were already, even before they left the American shores, were prepared to see visuals of dangerous other religions. So they had that prime, but then in some ways, I think they found themselves surprised by also being really attracted to the pagodas, of finding them enchanting, of seeing the way the sun glistened off the gold, of hearing the little bells dinging, of seeing the communities that gathered there in reverence and renewed ethical precepts and all of that. And so the pagoda became this site where you really had these missionaries being acted upon by the local Burmese communities and culture. They couldn't just go and say, oh, look at all this. This needs to be, tear this down. They found themselves returning again to these sites like Shwedagon and other and smaller pagodas, and trying to understand them. And there were places where often you find them reflecting, trying to think about what does it mean to have these teachings of a path of freedom? What is nibbana? What is being unbound from this world? What is it how is the Buddha still powerful for these people? What are the vows that regular people and monastics take? And so they were really, I mean, it's still, like you say, these pagodas are these powerful sites. And so the missionaries wrote in complex ways about them. And so I wanted to think about how they understood the pagoda. At first, it was just a sense of being overwhelmed. Adoniram Judson, his third wife, Emily Judson, who was a writer back in the States before she became a missionary, she just from the boat, even before setting her feet on the shore, just looks out, she writes in her diary about shaking and almost crying, looking at Shwedagon and the other pagodas and just being so overwhelmed by these spaces. And then as people become more and more familiar with Burmese culture and Buddhist traditions, you have them actually using the pagoda as a way to understand like how things like merit work. So you have these kind of scholar missionaries who are really trying to understand, logics of karma. How does one accumulate good merit for themselves and for others? And so it also becomes this kind of academic site for some of them. And then they do a lot later scholars do. They sort of use it as a representation of abstract Buddhist ideas as a way to understand Buddhist doctrine and compare it with Protestant theology. But it's something about the physical space itself that became really important for these missionaries.
And there was also often a side of debate, right, of sort of confrontation as well, because I suppose it's very easy to have a discussion about religion when you're in front of something so towering.
Yeah, and it's also where people were gathering anyway, so to go on full moon days and so on, to go to these places and knowing the rhythm, and then and some people would go and maybe they would have quiet debates. And then of course we have some examples of missionaries who were quite violent, who would stand up and sort of in a sort of a menacing way threaten Buddhist statues and say, look, this Buddhist statue can't fight back. And so there was a whole range of missionary techniques that were tried in these places. And then it wasn't just, of course, the missionaries. I mean, there were these sectarian developments. At that same chapter, I write about this mysterious sect known as the Paramats, which we don't know much about, but there's actually a lot of stuff about them in the American Baptist missionary archives about this group who is challenging mainstream forms of Buddhism and trying to find a more pure form of Buddhism. And what was happening in places like pagodas and the material expressions of Buddhism was a key site for their issues with what needed to change and transformation. So these sites as they are today, I think were so important for conflict and change.
And then you finish your book. Your final chapter, final object is the portrait. Looking at the portrait allows you to explore the continuing legacy, 200 years on, of the famous, in particular of the famous Judson missionaries and their time in Burma. And you get to explore the religious and political concerns of Baptists in Myanmar today, or 10 years ago. You write this chapter quite differently to the rest of the book because you adopt a bit of a life writing approach from when you were a very special kind of tourist in Myanmar. So please paint us a portrait of your take on the portrait.
Yes, it is a different chapter. It is the chapter where I speak more in first person. I even refer to my parents, so it's like I just describe the fact that, I went on this. I myself had not grown up in a Baptist church. And I was from the northeastern part of the United States, and I grew up with a Catholic mother and atheist father. So I was very interested. I'd been studying Baptists in a historical context, but this is the first time that I actually was spending time in Baptist communities. And it was really interesting. I'd been to Myanmar before. When I was an undergraduate student, I was studying Burmese Buddhist nuns. So I had some long-standing interest in Burma, but this was the first time really exploring lived Baptist Christianity there. And it was quite fascinating. I went with this group of Americans through the American Baptist Historical Society. They were very gracious about allowing me on as a researcher. They had questions about what I was doing, were, very welcoming. And then we spent a lot of time with different communities. This was the 200-year anniversary of the mission. So this was 2013. This was also a time of some democratic reforms, a relative opening up of the country. We also have the beginnings of the Rohingya genocide. So it was a really particular time to be in the country. And the itinerary was determined by the legacy of these early missionaries. So we went to see where they landed, their first churches. We went to see where Adoniram Judson was in prison during the first Anglo-Burmese War, where his wife and his young daughter Maria died shortly thereafter in the South. So it was really about these particular figures. And so we went to visit lots of different people, opened their churches up to us and their homes. And one thing that fascinated me when I was on this tour is how many portraits there were of Jesus and the Judsons. And the portraits of Jesus were largely these, some of your listeners might know Warner Salomon's paintings of Jesus, very Anglo, sort of white, fair-skinned Jesus, very sort of a personal kind of Jesus. And even the Judsons themselves, who had been studying historically, who I knew were, brown-haired Americans who got rid of their Edwardian dress for more local clothing. In these portraits of them, they're wearing the high collars of Edwardian dress that, of course, they wouldn't have worn in Myanmar. It would have been too hot. It would have been hard to keep up that kind of wardrobe. And sometimes they would even be painted as blonde. And so I started asking questions. What was it to have this very hyper anglicized image, as sort of Anglo-American vision of the legacy of the mission? Why was that meaningful? And talking to people about what it was to connect to this particular history and to remember them in this particular way. And, people were talking about, this idea of them being Americans, of them being foreigners, having this connection to a global or an international church that has this long history. And I started to see it as this way that, yes, it was not just a casualty, like, oh, look at this is the way that Western imperialism and colonialism continues, but also a way that people, local congregations, might find some strength and power in identifying with a church with these Anglo-American histories and wanting to identify with this more global network of Christians. And so it was really interesting to me. I mean, I did not expect that, and really started to become really interested in all of the images. And it was everywhere we went. It wasn't just in certain places, like in Yangon, for example. I mean, we would go to these churches in the South, or smaller places, and they would have these same kinds of Jesus and Judson imagery.
Yeah. Do you think that obviously the Judsons are incredibly revered figures, but are they sort of? Do you think is it fair to say that they are also sort of worshipped? I know that kind of goes against the idea, but if their portraits are being put alongside Jesus, how do you have anything else to say about the way that the Judsons are thought about in Burma today?
Yeah, I definitely revered. And I almost think that there's a certain kind of martyrdom that happens, which you don't see as much, in sort of official Protestant doctrine. That's usually associated with Catholicism and part of the criticism, right, that Protestants have. But there was a way that these figures were seen as, I think, martyrs. I mean, I even did another project where I was looking specifically in the US at this fascination in the 19th century with the mission, and specifically with Adoniram's death and Anne Judson's death. And there's a lot of sort of martyr language. Even this one image that his third wife, Emily Judson, helps create shows, he even says, Adoniram at the time when he was describing the scene of him when he was imprisoned and sees Anne, who comes to visit him, and he's on his knees, and he says she looks like a Madonna figure. She's holding her baby. She comes in. And so there's this idea, sort of drawing on these larger Christian tropes of martyrs, and through not only the 200-year anniversary, but I was looking at the 100-year celebrations, the 150 celebrations, and this idea that these people they sacrificed themselves for this greater good, and to remember them and to mourn with them, especially in the 19th century sort of Victorian period of mourning culture, to mourn with them and to think about their lives was a way to sort of participate in this bigger, important effort of evangelizing the world, and to eventually then join them in heaven.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Now, I know that you're still researching this topic. You published an article this year that is also about the religious history of Myanmar and the Kamavacha and the changes to the Kamavacha. So do you plan to continue this? Are you going to continue researching in this vein on this topic, the religious history of Burma, or what's next for you?
Well, as we were talking about before the show, I started working a little bit with the curator. The curator, Alexandra Green at the British Museum, is doing this wonderful exhibition from Burma to Myanmar, wanting to think about Myanmar's place in a larger network of countries and trade and cultural exchange. And as part of what I was interested in for that exhibition was on different natural resources. And, as we know, Myanmar has an incredible landscape with rubies and gold and teak and lacquer and silver and jade and all of that. And so I'm really interested in sort of continuing to think alongside this material culture history. But thinking a little bit bigger in terms of these connections through these natural resources. What is it to extract these resources? What is it to exploit people in the borderlands that are working to extract these resources? How do these resources fuel a certain kind of creativity in creating different religious expressions? So I'm definitely still interested in religious history and material culture. I spent a lot of time with the Baptist Mission, and so I think I will take a break from that for a long time. There are other researchers who are doing really cool stuff. Hitomi Fujimura, Will Womack. There are other people who are going to do really interesting things about the Baptist Mission. So there's more to say, but I think I've sort of said my part for now.
Well, that sounds terrific. Shifting to looking at natural resources, I look forward to reading everything that you come up with there. There's a lot that's written about it in the contemporary era, right? But religion is never a part of it, as far as I'm aware. So that would be fascinating because yes, as I said at the beginning of the show, that article that you wrote about the Enfield rifles and teak is terrific, and hopefully listeners will go and check that out. The last thing that we always do on this show, though, is to ask you for a recommendation, which can be anything you like to do with Myanmar. It can be a book or something you've watched or something that you do. Do you have anything that you'd like to recommend to leave the audience with before we sign off?
Well, I'd encourage people who can make it to London. This exhibition is opening November 2nd. It's called From Burma to Myanmar. And Alexandra Green, the curator, has done so much work. I mean, just recently published a book on silver in Myanmar. She published a book on Southeast Asia through objects. And so I'm sure your readers, even if don't connect all of those dots or familiar with some of that work, but to go back and really see the amazing productions coming out of that collection and specifically out of that scholar, Alexandra Green. She's really doing some fascinating stuff. And I'm sure there'll be more to it.
That's an excellent recommendation. Thank you so much for that. And I again recommend everybody go out and get this book, Baptizing Burma, Religious Change in the Last Buddhist Kingdom, published with Columbia University Press. Congratulations on the publication, and thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me back. It's great talking to you.